Dear class, welcome back to American National Government. Let's talk about economic systems and perspectives on land and nature. So for the last couple of weeks, we've talked about economic systems, we've talked about community engagement, we've talked about early forms of political system in the US and also economic systems. Now we've started to talk about property. So let's start thinking about how all of this come together. In this section, we're going to talk about what an economic system is and also what the different types of economic systems are and how they relate to property. Let's start with feudalism. Feudalism is something we became familiar with in the first week. We looked at Sweezy and Dobb. We also learned about capitalism in the same paper. Pre-feudal societies. What are they? In the readings that we have looked at related to Native American culture, such as Vine Deloria Jr.'s paper, and also more recently, looking at Winona LaDuke, if you were able to look at that, that was optional. But also looking at the videos on public land management, talking about common and public lands. We're interested in how pre-feudal societies thought about land. What is feudalism? Let's recap. So Sweezy and Daub describe feudalism as a system in which the means of production are owned by a class of people called lords. Lords are conferred such rights by monarchs or kings and queens. So this is the system in England around the time, or rather before 1500 AD. In this system, there is a hierarchy. Lords have control over territory and those who live under them. The serfs or workers produce what they are told to by the lords and for use by the people within the territory, and all of them report to the monarchs, right? I mean, the lords report to the monarchs. So there's a system of hierarchy. And why did serfs listen? So we know that it's about control of land. The lords control the land. The serfs need work. They don't have land, right? And so they comply. They have no choice. How ruthless is the system? In most cases, we know that the lords pay a tax to the monarchs and the serfs pay a tax to the lords. And so, depending on how much tax the lords had to pay and how much the serfs had to pay, can tell you what kind of stress is built into the system, right? More the tax rates, or rather higher the tax rates, you can say that there is some kind of oppression within the system based on the tax rates, right? So what is capitalism? So Sweezy and Dobb described that feudalism is for production is for use in the same kind of um, in the same kind of social system where you might have monarchs, lords, and serfs. Imagine that production has been intensified and it's now for trade and for greater and greater profit. So we are not producing for local use anymore. The idea is to produce a few goods that other territories will buy. The mode of production was agriculture in the earliest stages of capitalism, and here it stays the same. It's still agricultural, or it's forestry, or it's fisheries, but the focus is still extraction, right? You grow things, you harvest trees for, wood, you are still just dealing with nature. And the focus is growing a few crops, which we call cash crops, right? Because we're just going to grow a few and we're going to grow them all over the place. Later on, more machinery is used in agriculture, but the goal remains the same. Um, in early stages of industrial capitalism, workers were needed to put things together in assembly lines. So here we see this is a new type of capitalism. So in the earlier form, we have agricultural capitalism, and then we move to where production is set up in factories or shops, and it's not about extraction from nature. It's now what can we produce using what we extracted, right? So workers were needed to put things together in assembly lines. In later stages of industry, less and less workers are needed. The machines can do the work themselves. So I'm talking about different types of capitalism here because we often think of capitalism as just this factory-based production. But as Sweezy and Dobb show, it actually starts with agriculture. So since the tractor trailers were created in the 1900s, human labor in agriculture has actually plummeted sharply. Until then, agriculture was the primary form of industry where most of the employment occurred. In 2000, only 2% of US labor was employed in agriculture, and the statistics are comparable today. The final stage of capitalism is called financial capitalism. We will talk about this another time. So, how ruthless is this early form of capitalism? So, this again depends on your tax rates. What kind of tax do the serfs have to pay? And what do the lords have to pay to the government, right? So, the government in this situation may or may not be a monarchy. The British uh, still have their uh, royals, though they're only in a ceremonial position now. They don't have much power when it comes to government. But back in the day, the British lords had a lot of power. Um, the British monarchs, of course, ruled, but the lords also played a big role. During the time of capitalism, 1600s, we see that the lords are fleeing England for better environments where they can grow more and more products, food, and other kinds of extractive stuff. But the goal was more profits. So, this is the reason why many of the European lords got out of Europe, right? And they came to America and other parts of the world. They took over those places. So, the history of British colonialism also tells us about the nature of how the tax system worked, and what happened if you did not pay taxes. So that if you look at India, you look at British colonial rule in India between 1660 to 1947, you can see that the British government could take away land rights from the local Indian lords who did not meet the tax and production quotas. The system was called the zamindari system or the land management system. And of course, because of this, many lords put a lot of pressure on the peasants to produce the quotas. So the system was quite vicious and quite violent. Um, so because profit is the most important goal here. We see that there's a lot of violence, not just when it came to extracting taxes, but also in colonizing and gaining control over territories, right? So that's step one, essentially. You have to gain the territory before you can have an extract, very vicious process of extracting profits from people, right? So, in the early years of the US, the federal government actually became very involved in forceful relocation of Native American people from their lands in the southern states. And essentially, they were made to move to areas with poorer soil as far as agriculture, namely to Oklahoma. And of course, we have talked about indentured servants and of slavery, and the fact that these two were actually very big institutions in the early stages of European colonialism in the US. We know that these are oppressive arrangements, right? So we know that the system is not a fun place, basically. So, what is a pre-feudal economic system then? So, if we start with Sweezy and Dobbs' understanding of feudalism and of capitalism, we can imagine that a pre-feudal society is probably a society without monarchs, lords, and serfs. We are talking about more decentralized power, more egalitarianism, more equality, right? So, how is this possible in large groups of people? Maybe these are smaller groups of people, not large towns, not cities. Uh, Maybe these are smaller, but who knows? These are some things to think about. So we read Vine Deloria and we learned something about Native American values. And he suggests that the Native American perspectives have to do with this hunter-gatherer kind of perspective where you are gaining food from the forest. You have to clear the land for growing vegetables. And so you develop sort of a more particular understanding of nature. You're an observer. You are looking for food, but essentially you're foraging food. You're not planting necessarily too much food, but you understand, you know where the food can be found, right? So once you start to watch animals or nature, you notice their personalities, and it's hard to kill an animal, right? So we also learn from Vine that there is uh, a show of respect to the animals that are sacrificed for food. The plant, the fish, the animals in the forest are therefore revered. They're not necessarily treated as objects. They're treated as living things with personalities, right? Um, so food, thus, in this system is not entertainment. It is consumed just enough for survival, right? We acknowledge at every step the sacrifice made by the other species. So Winona LaDuke is talking about humans as stewards of the land, of plants, fish, and water, especially. So for her, it's not just about the relationships we have with these personalities being, nature, but the evils created by modern society that force us to become stewards of land, plants, fish, and water, right? So she talks about community engagement in Native American nations. This is around environmental activism. So they want to oppose corporations who have dumped industrial and nuclear waste in their waters, air, and land. Many suffer from severe illness in the Native American reservations because of the closeness of these factories that are polluting the waters, the land, and the air. And the rate of disease or illness is very high when compared to the rest of American society. So that's her angle. So we did not study Michael Lerma's work. He's a scholar, another scholar, and he's Native American as well, he's a political scientist. And he's talking about how do Native Americans think about land. And he says, firstly, they never think land can be owned. This is not in their culture to think of land as ownership. Land as ownership is a very non-Native American perspective. So their claim to land is not about property. Theirs is as stewards of land, meaning they see themselves, as Vine Deloria and Winona LaDuke have mentioned, as people who are close to land, nature, living animals. There's a relationship. And because of the closeness and the understanding and the relationship, there is a need for taking care of these others. And so humans in this situation become stewards of the land. And this is their claim to land. So who will oppose corporations and governments today that are dumping all over, with their chemical and nuclear waste? It has to be the Native American people. And so for him, the idea of Native American sovereignty has to do with speaking up against these kinds of evils, for doing and for being stewards of the land, essentially. So these are some ways of thinking about not just pre-feudal, but also very latest forms of thinking about land and nature. What is our relationship going to be with land and nature? So here's a bibliography. Check these out when you get time. Of course, we learned Vine Deloria Jr., Winona LaDuke has been linked. You guys are not required to read Ranajit Guha and learn about peasant insurgency in colonial India. You may check out Amartya Sen's paper on famines in world development. It's quite interesting. Um, and so these are the books which I discussed, or the writings. So let me stop here. This is enough conversation for today. And I'll let you watch the videos by that are related to land and property for weeks 5 and 6.